Thank you for listening to the Conform to Christ podcast, where we seek to engage the mind, affect the heart, and call people to follow Christ. Jay Jones, and I'm here with George Mays for Text Driven Tuesday. Good morning, George.
Good morning.
So, George, you covered an entire chapter.
Entire chapter. Yep.
I feel like you should get like some type of medallion or something for that.
You think so?
Some type of an award.
Yeah.
That's a lot. That's a
Some
lot
kind
of
of badge.
text. That's a lot of text to be covered.
Well, it's 13 verses.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a shorter chapter.
Eh.
There's a lot in there,
Yeah, there was.
but
yeah.
it all goes together.
No, you're right. And
It's
a lot.
It's one of those. It's one of those passages. Like, man, I could break it up, but I just don't know
Yeah.
if it's for the best.
So Hebrews chapter 8, and you, I think best probably to keep it like you did all together. As you said, there are some things that are, a lot of it's, review is not the right word, but it is like a review. It's the same thing that's come up again,
Right.
especially in the first point.
Mm-hmm.
But that's okay, because we need to have that repetition.
Yeah.
That's the best way to learn anything, is through repetition. So, and that's the way it's laid out.
Yeah.
And you began by asking about monumental events in world history, like the invention of the wheel
Mm-hmm.
and the printing press, things like that trying to change the course of world history. And then you bridged into the coming of Christ as like the key event in all of world history. Right? Even the dates. We measure time by that event.
Yeah.
Even in the secular world, like they change it to Common Era.
Yeah. Yeah. BCE.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like what?
BCE and
Like where?
Common Era.
Like where are you? Where are you seeing the switch from before the Common Era to the Common Era?
Right. Yeah.
It's the same. It's the same. It's the same event. They just are trying to mask it. It's the same event.
Mm-hmm. So this is the big event, and so in particular, Hebrews is concerned with who Christ is, because how monumental this is, and we're in the section of chapter 8, which you call the heart of the book.
Yeah, I think so. I think that he begins by saying, "Now the point in what we are saying is this," and the word that's translated in the ESV as point is it can be translated as sum. So
Okay.
the sum of everything we've been saying is this: we
Uh-huh.
have such a high priest, and
Right.
then he just, like you said, he just kind of reviews everything that he's said
Mm-hmm.
about Christ and his priesthood, and then we get to verse 6, which I think it's the heart of the chapter. I think it kind of tells us what the entire chapter is about.
Mm-hmm.
And it's dealing with Christ's ministry and the new covenant and the promises that are in the new covenant. So everything that's led up to chapter 8 has been, who is Jesus? So he started with, he's the Son, he's greater than the angels, Moses, Joshua, and then we get into this big section of the book, which is his priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
So we've dealt with that from the end of chapter 4 all the way through chapter 7, talking about his priesthood, and now he really is going to talk about what does he do as this priest? What are the implications for this? And so he's going to deal with the new covenant, and the new covenant has to be instituted by blood, has to be instituted by sacrifice, and so chapters 9 and 10 are really going to hone in on that, and then 11 through the end of the book will be how should we respond
Okay.
to this. So
All right.
I think that chapter 8 really gets at what is he really driving at? What's the point of this book? Why is he writing this to these new Jewish Christians? And I think it's to really highlight the priesthood of Christ and how all of the institutions that are in Jerusalem are just a shadow that we're pointing to Christ. And so here's the substance, here's the reality.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really what he's driving at, and he makes his point here in chapter 8.
Right. So I missed the what you called your kind of proposition statement, like three ways Christ priesthood is superior. I can't remember what you said, but I got the 3 points.
Well, I think that really it was that I think verse 6 just is the summary statement, and so
Uh-huh.
I looked at it and
Took
said,
your
"There's
outline
my
there.
outline." Yeah.
Okay.
So Christ has obtained a ministry that's more excellent than that of the old
Mm-hmm.
because he mediates a better covenant that's established on better promises.
Yeah. So
And that really is and flowing out of that is the idea that if this is it, if this is true, that Christ has a better ministry and a better covenant, better promises, then it would be insanity to leave the church to go back to the old.
right.
That's the whole point is
Mm-hmm.
they're being tempted to go back to Jerusalem, go back to the temple and the sacrifices and the priesthood, because of the persecution they're facing. But if Christ has obtained a ministry that's more excellent than the ministry that the Levitical priests have, because he mediates a better covenant than that which the priests are, I guess, mediating at the temple
Mm-hmm.
through the law, and there's better promises, then why would you go back?
Yeah.
Why would you go back? So that's what he's trying to impress upon them, and that's what I was trying to impress upon the congregation yesterday.
Right. Okay. So as we move through here, we'll since obviously, I mean, I guess there could be people in our church that were Jewish and maybe would consider going back. Um, let's try to then make some applications for each one for our particular context. And what do these points mean for us now?
Yeah.
So let's do that as we go through. But first, let's have you read chapter 8,
Okay.
please.
All right. Hebrews chapter 8, beginning in verse 1, it reads, "Now the point in what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, 'See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain.' But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. For he finds fault with them when he says, 'Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. They shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, 'Know the Lord,' for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more." In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away.
Okay.
And I got these new progressive lens glasses, and I'm trying to like find the sweet spot so I can read the
Oh, you haven't figured
read
them
the
out yet?
text. No, not quite. Yeah. So
Hmm.
if I move my head a little bit too far, it's blurry. So it's fun.
Yeah. All right. So your first point, Christ. This is verses 1 through 5. Christ's better ministry. A little bit of some repetition from other things that
Yeah.
have been covered already, but that's okay. And
And there is some hints from earlier in the book, like grammatically. So that first verse, we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. You go back to chapter 1, verse 3, and it talks about him being seated at the right hand of the majesty.
Right.
So he's going back to the beginning. Verse 6, the grammar is very similar to chapter 1, verse 4, where he's superior to the angels because he's inherited a name that is much more excellent than theirs. And I tried to emphasize, maybe not. I know I did it more in our community group, but this when we're talking about he's obtained a ministry that is much more excellent. We need to remember this isn't in. It's not in like degrees. Like here's the old.
Right.
Christ is a couple of clicks above. Like this is an infinite gap. So it's not like, well, you can choose the new, which is better, but the old is still good. It's just not quite as good.
Right.
What he's saying is that Jesus is not just a rank above angels. He's infinitely better than the angels.
Right.
The ministry that he is performing, and the covenant that he mediates is not just a little bit better; it's infinitely better. Right?
Yeah. So you had three ways that he's better, and they were that he's a better priest, he ministers in a better temple, and he has better sacrifice.
Right.
So those are your three main, and then we'll talk a little bit about the shadow, the reality and the shadow when we get to verse 5. But he is a better priest, so explain to us, like move through it, a better priest and a better temple and a better sacrifice. And I think one will be a lot of rehash if someone's already listened for. So maybe do a little more on part 2, because that might be interesting, I think, to people who haven't haven't encountered or thought about what is being said here.
Yeah, so he's a better priest. So we looked at that in chapter 7, that perfection was not attainable through the Levitical priest. So one after the order of Melchizedek has to arise. He's not a priest based on some kind of genealogical law, but on his indestructible life. And so he's perfect, and he remains a priest forever. So he's obviously better. We've talked about that. But he introduces kind of a new idea. He'll talk about it a little bit more in chapter 9, that Christ, he ministers not in the earthly temple, but in the heavenly one. So this should be obvious. You've got the Levitical priest. They have to be Levites. They're the ones that minister in the Jerusalem temple. Jesus is not a Levite, right? He's from Judah, and so he doesn't minister in the Jerusalem temple. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't minister in a temple. There's a heavenly temple, and that's what he says in verses 4 and 5. He says if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are already Levites, right? But verse 5 is a pretty profound verse. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." And that's a quote from Exodus chapter 25, verses 9 and 40. He says it in 26:30 and 27:8. So 4 times in Exodus, Moses is instructed as he's receiving the kind of the blueprints for the tabernacle. Make sure that you make it exactly as you saw the heavenly tabernacle.
Right.
And this says it literally means that which you were caused to see. So we have the words, and we have like dimensions, and make it like this, and verbal instructions.
Right.
But it would seem that Moses actually saw it. So whether it was, I don't know if it was a vision or I don't know. He was shown the heavenly tabernacle,
Mm-hmm.
and he was told to make the earthly one to
Right.
look like it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Which is that's pretty awesome.
Mm-hmm.
I think. I mean, he's supposed. So the earthly tabernacle, it's a copy. It's a pattern. It's an example. So there's a real one, or the original, and the earthly one is
The copy.
the copy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so what that means is that Jesus, again, he's a superior priest who's ministering in the original temple.
Mm-hmm.
He's so the Levites in the earthly tabernacle and later the temple, they are just a copy of the real, right?
Yeah. Let's. Where do we see the real? So the real, original
Mm-hmm.
temple,
Right.
which is God's dwelling.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we see it in the Bible?
We see it in Revelation.
Mhm.
There's places in Revelation that we see it.
Okay.
There's places in the prophets where they see his throne.
Right.
Um,
The train of his robe filled
yeah, the temple.
the temple.
Right.
Yeah. Isaiah chapter 6.
I don't
and
know
there's-
if there's
and
a
the-
place where it's
And he sees someone who's like a man
mhm, right,
in that temple.
right, yeah. But the clearest places I think would be found in Revelation.
Right. Yeah. You get imagery there.
Mhm.
I thought about Job, the beginning of Job.
Mm.
Now it doesn't say temple, but
Right,
it's
it's-
implied that this is God has a court. He's
Right.
like holding a court, and people or supernatural
Mhm.
people, let's call them that, angels, archangels, they're around his throne.
Yeah.
So he comes somewhere. I think implied this is the same place.
Yeah. Revelation chapter 11, verse 19. It's the last verse of Revelation 11. Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. Chapter 15, verses 5 through 8. After this, I looked, and the sanctuary of the tent of witness in heaven was opened. Out of the sanctuary came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues, clothed in pure bright linen with golden sashes around their chests. And one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God who lives forever and ever. And the sanctuary was filled with smoke and the glory of God and from his power, and no one could enter the sanctuary until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were finished. And I think it would be easy for us to read that as it's just a vision, so it's just symbolic.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not how the author of Hebrews is speaking about it. He's speaking about it as there's a heavenly temple, and it's an actual place, and the earthly tabernacle was a copy of it, and so the Levites were supposed to they're supposed to worship God in this copy. Right? We've got other places. Hebrews 9, verse 11, when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption.
Yeah.
Verse 23, it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites. So Moses sprinkled blood on the copies, right? But the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. So again, this is he's emphasizing the fact that Christ's ministry is better.
Right.
So the Levites, they had a glorious ministry under the law to offer sacrifices for forgiveness of sins in the tabernacle or in the temple, but it was a copy. It was a copy.
Yeah.
Christ has actually gone into the original,
Yeah.
and so his ministry is as superior to the Levites' ministry as the tabernacle he's gone into is superior to the copy that was in Jerusalem. Right?
Yeah. Yep. And as we discussed already, and he has a better sacrifice.
Right. Yeah.
a one-time perfect sacrifice.
Mhm. Yeah, the Levites, Moses, he sprinkled, the tabernacle with animal blood. The Levites, they sacrificed animals, but Jesus has gone into the original, not with the blood of animals,
Mm-hmm.
because the superior tabernacle has to be sprinkled with superior blood,
Right.
and it's the blood of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that verse 5, it really kind of clues us into how we're supposed to read our Bibles.
Okay. Yeah.
That they're serving a copy and a shadow.
Mm-hmm.
So when we read our Old Testament, we read it as Christians. We don't
Right.
read it as unbelieving Jews, right? We have to look. How does the New Testament show us what these things mean in their fullness?
Uh-huh.
And so when we see the Levites sacrificing animals in the tabernacle, we need to recall that this is a shadow that's pointing forward to a greater reality. It's
Mhm.
pointing forward to Christ and
Right.
His work and what
Mhm.
he has accomplished for His people. Colossians chapter 2 verses 16 and 17, Paul tells the Corinthian or the Christians in Colossia, don't let anyone pass judgment on you in regards to festivals and new moons and Sabbaths. These all are a shadow, but the substance is Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And so this helps us when you're reading through the Old Testament, especially when you're reading some of the more difficult books of the law, like Leviticus, Deuteronomy, remembering when you're reading through these sacrifices and reading through these festivals and the things that had to be done at the temple, it's all pointing to Jesus. So you've got the gospel that's being preached in the Old Testament under these shadows,
Right.
but it's being preached.
Yeah.
It's not you don't have two different ways of salvation in the Bible. In the Old Testament, they're saved by faith in the substance that's in the shadows. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a movement. I can't remember the name of it. It's like Hebrew something. What, do you know what it is? It's like a
What, the Hebrew roots?
maybe Hebrew roots. Yeah. Where they observe the shadows. That's the best way to describe it.
Well, even groups like the Seventh Day Adventist, they still try to follow a lot of the ceremonial
Right.
stuff.
Yeah.
There's questions as to can a Christian observe the Passover? I don't know if it's wrong for a Christian to observe the Passover. If they're commemorating the Exodus.
Right.
But if you're doing this because that's what the law tells you to do, and you're trying to like observe these things,
Right.
you have to remember that it was a shadow. It was pointing forward to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Christ, he superseded the Passover meal with his own meal,
Right.
right? The Lord's Supper.
And that's what I was going to say.
Right.
We do observe Passover.
Right.
We do it when we take the Lord's
Yeah.
Supper together. Yeah.
Paul tells the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 that our Passover has been sacrificed.
Mhm.
It's Christ. Christ has been sacrificed. He is our Passover lamb. So when we're reading, we need to remember that the substance, that's what Paul says. Colossians 2:17. The shadow of the festivals and new moons and the Sabbaths, they're a shadow, but the body, he uses the word for body,
Mhm.
is Christ. So it's what would you rather do? Would you rather observe the shadows, or would you rather see the substance?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Um,
There's not a greater form of spirituality for a Christian
yeah.
to be a Christian and to observe Old Testament shadows.
Right.
It doesn't make you more spiritual or more pious
Right.
or anything.
Mm-hmm.
So there's really, other than for serving like a historical reason,
I
or
mean,
educational purposes,
Right.
like our spiritualism, if that's a correct word, that's not how we practice
Yeah.
Christianity.
Yeah. Think about a shadow. and the word is used intentionally. And you know what the Greek word shadow means?
A shadow.
A shadow. Yeah, there's not like some spiritual meaning to it. It's a shadow. So what do you think about a shadow? I mean, you look at a shadow, you see just like an outline, right? You can kind of get what the shadow is supposed to be, but if you want to see the actual object, you look at the the actual object, right?
Right.
That's what's going on in the Old Testament. They're seeing the shadowy outline of Christ in the Levitical priesthood and in the tabernacle and in the animal sacrifices and in the Sabbaths and the festivals, the Passover. They're seeing a shadowy outline. But when Christ actually comes and he dies and is raised and he ascends, there's the substance. There's the object to which all the shadows were supposed to be pointing you to.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So to make much about the shadows would be like me holding up a toy for Josiah. Oh, play with that shadow, and I've
Right.
got the toy in my hand. Right?
Yeah.
What's better? What's superior?
Mm-hmm.
Is it the shadow on the ground, or is it the actual toy?
Yeah.
Right? It's the same here. Don't go back to the shadows. The substance has come.
Mm-hmm. All right, good. All right, let's move on to the second point. The second point is Christ mediates a better covenant. So I think it'll be interesting to talk about this as we move through this section, but let's, for the reader, make clear what a covenant actually is in its historical background.
Yeah. So I don't know where I got this definition. I'm 100% certain it's not mine, but a covenant, the children's catechism that the children learn on Wednesday nights, it just says a covenant is an agreement between two or more persons, because a covenant doesn't have to be between God and man. Abraham makes a covenant with Abimelech, two men,
Right.
but a covenant between God and man is a solemn oath initiated by God.
Mm-hmm.
It's sealed by a sign. It's filled with obligations on the part of God and man, and it's accompanied by promises and sanctions, or blessings and cursings.
Right.
So it's not just we think of contracts.
Mm-hmm.
You could sign a contract with
I read.
a stranger, right? But a covenant is more relational.
Yeah. I read somewhere that in the ancient background, like say you had a really powerful, like everyone started as like warlords back in the day, right?
Right.
But let's say a warlord conquers a region. Now he holds like a lot of power. Now he's like more like a king, right? They call them kings.
Right.
Well, let's say there's a neighboring city, state, or collection of cities, right? And they say, okay, he's very powerful, but there's some very dangerous people to our west. They may enter into a covenant with that king, and the king will say something, to the effect of, as their like lord, that he will protect them, whatever. And then they have on their part things they must do to stay in covenant with him.
Right. I think that you would see this in Genesis chapter 14, which has ties to what we've been talking about in Hebrews. You got Chedorlaomer. Remember talking about him months ago.
Yep.
Chedorlaomer. He was over in the east, kind of around Babylon, and he had four kings, or three kings that were with him. Right. So he was the main guy, and he had these other kings, and they probably had a covenant with him.
Right.
So we'll serve you, or we'll give you stuff, and if we have to go to battle, you come with us, or if you go to battle, we'll go with you. And it usually was accompanied with something like
there were
they would
blessings, blessings and cursings.
Yeah, they'd lay an animal down, and they'd cut it down the middle, like from top to bottom, right, and lay it on its sides, and then the two parties would walk between the pieces, and the the symbolism of that was, may the same thing be done to me if I break the covenant. We see this in Genesis 15. When God makes a covenant with Abraham, he tells Abraham to cut these pieces, like this animal, cut it into pieces. And then Abraham sees a torch and a flaming pot passing through the pieces, which is interesting in itself because Abraham doesn't walk through the pieces.
Right. Only God walks
Only
through.
God walks through the pieces, right? So he takes upon himself the obligations and the sanctions to fulfill the covenant, right? So that's the seriousness,
Right.
of a covenant in the ancient Near East.
Right, and it really has a more of a relational aspect to it than strictly like, hey, we enter into some type of business agreement. It's just a legal agreement.
Right.
It's more of relational. Like I'm your Lord.
Right.
You're my servant.
Right.
In a larger, like, it can be in a larger city state thing. It could be something like individual.
Yeah. You belong to me. I belong to you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And marriage is
marriage is a covenant.
That's the best example that we have.
Right.
We enter into a covenant. Now our culture has gotten to the place where it's just a contract.
Yeah, it's just a legal thing.
And if you don't, satisfy me in this contract, well, I can opt out and get a no fault divorce.
Right.
But that's not what marriage is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a solemn oath that is accompanied with promises, and there's a sign. You got a wedding ring, and it's supposed to be until death do us part.
Yeah, covenant between man, woman, and God till death.
Right.
Yeah. And there are 6 major covenants in the Bible. This might be a surprise or something new to a lot of people. And I guess maybe there's even some debate among theologians about was there. So we'll start at the beginning.
Yeah.
And I agree that I believe there's a covenant in the beginning with Adam.
With Adam. You can either call it the Adamic covenant or a covenant with creation. There's different ways. Some people will say the covenant of works.
Right.
But now we're really going down the rabbit hole. But just to, weed through it a little bit, the covenant with Adam.
Right.
God is the covenant Lord. He puts Adam in this garden that is like a tabernacle. It's like a temple, where he's supposed to work it and keep it. This is language that's used later of the Levites. They're supposed to work and keep the tabernacle. And God gives him a law.
Yeah, he has. There's one law.
There's one law.
And so here's where theologians disagree. I don't spend a lot of time on it. Some say that it's only a covenant of works. Do this and you will live. Break the covenant, you will die.
Right.
However, I believe it's also a covenant of grace because he did not do anything to become the king of everything. Adam's the king of everything. Did you think of him as that?
Yeah, I think that again. There's the definition I gave. God initiates it.
Right.
Like Adam doesn't initiate this covenant with God. God initiates it with him. Same with Israel. God initiates it with Israel. God initiates it with Noah. He initiates it with Abraham. It's always God.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's Adam. Then next is Noah.
Noah.
The sign of that covenant's the rainbow.
The rainbow.
And then from there we go to Abraham. The sign of the covenant is
circumcision.
And so the Abrahamic covenant is clearly, I believe, to be differentiated from the covenant with Moses.
Yeah, it's interesting because circumcision, Paul pairs circumcision with the law. But God enters into the covenant with Abraham before he gives him circumcision.
Right.
So Abraham believes God and is counted to him as righteousness before circumcision is ever given.
Right.
Right. So Paul does he does tie circumcision in with the law. But the covenant with Abraham is not. It's a covenant of promise. It's not. It's not a covenant of works.
And there's also all nations inside this Abrahamic covenant. So we can. This is just This is a huge. Thing.
We could talk about this for.
Then we go to Moses.
Yeah.
And this covenant was
Moses, Israel.
Yeah.
It's It's called the Mosaic
It's
Covenant,
the
even
Sinai-
though
the covenant
even though
Sinai.
it's even though it's a covenant that's made with Israel.
Right.
Moses is the mediator.
Yeah.
He's the go between.
Mm-hmm.
You see it very clearly. Israel's down at the bottom of the mountain. God's at the top. Moses has to. This 80-year-old guy has to keep walking up and down the mountain because he's the mediator.
Yeah.
He's the one that is the go between. He speaks to God on behalf of the people. He speaks to the people on behalf of God.
Yeah.
And under that, that's the law.
Yeah.
Right. The law is given to Israel. So this is the big one.
Right.
This is the one that we're talking about here.
Okay.
When we talk about the old covenant, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the law.
Okay. Next would be
David.
okay.
Yeah. The Davidic covenant, found in 2 Samuel chapter 7,
Mm-hmm.
where God, again, initiates a covenant with David. David wants to build a temple for God. God says, I'm going to build you a house instead, and one of your sons is going to sit on the throne forever.
Okay. Next.
The new covenant.
All right.
And there's other little covenants. There's covenant renewal ceremonies, like Josiah. He renews the covenant, which would be the Mosaic covenant with the people. So there's little covenants, but those are the 6 big ones.
Uh-huh.
So the new one.
How about a seventh? Is there one that's debatable on the seventh? A seventh?
I don't think so.
All right.
No, there's 6 major covenants. There's
What about one that's pre-time?
pre-time. Well, yes, there is one that's pre-time. We don't.
Uh-huh.
We get that in places like Ephesians chapter 1. I don't know if Hebrews chapter 13 is mentioning that one. I'm more inclined to think it's the covenant of grace.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a Trinitarian
Right.
covenant.
Yeah.
And so this is the covenant that is between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit.
Right. And it's something that's kind of, it's not explicitly stated in Scripture. It's something that's kind of, you have to piece together through taking in the New Testament.
Right. Well, what we see throughout the Bible is that God, how does he interact with people?
Mm-hmm.
He interacts through covenants.
Mm-hmm.
Everywhere he enters into a relationship, it's always covenantal. And so when the Father is giving a bride to the Son, and the Son agrees to purchase the bride, the Spirit agrees to apply the work of the Son to the people to accomplish the work. The best way to see this is in covenantal terms.
Mm-hmm.
That if God always interacts as a covenant God, then the most foundational covenant would be a covenant between the 3 persons of the Trinity.
Right. So there's that, and that would give us the perfect number 7, George. The perfect number. But let's get back. We're getting off track.
That's true.
Okay, so
That's true.
Christ mediates a better covenant. So now let's talk about what is the distinction here is between really the law, the Mosaic covenant,
Mhm.
and between Christ who mediates a better covenant
Right.
than did the Levites and Moses.
Right.
All right.
Yeah. So when he says in verse 7, if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second.
Mhm.
So he's paring all 6 of these covenants down to there's the first one, which is the Mosaic covenant, the law, and the second one, which is the new covenant. He asked the question that he asked over in chapter 7, verse 11: if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, why does there need to be another priesthood after the order of Melchizedek? Right? If the first covenant had been faultless, that word is used all over the Old Testament to describe being morally blameless. So it's used a lot for Job. He's blameless.
Mm-hmm.
If it was blameless, if it was faultless, then what occasion would there be for a second one?
Mm-hmm.
Right. If the first one was good enough, why do we need a second one? If the first priesthood was good enough, why do we need a second one? Right. So he's following kind of the same. The
Yeah.
structure is kind of the same here.
Yeah, so the question is why do we need a new covenant?
Right.
Like what's wrong with the old covenant? Is there anything
Right.
really wrong with the old covenant
Yeah.
or is there something wrong with the covenant member?
Yeah, and that's what we have to be really careful to distinguish between, because Paul even says the law is holy and righteous and good.
Mhm.
So it's not the fault of the law, and we see that very clearly at the first line of verse 8, for he finds fault with them.
Yeah.
That's not a typo. That's not ambiguous. He could have said, if he was talking about the law, he could have said, for he finds fault with it. He
Right.
doesn't. He uses the plural. He finds fault with
Them.
them.
Mhm.
And the problem, he quotes from Jeremiah 31. This is the longest Old Testament quote in the New Testament,
Uh-huh.
which should, I think,
It's a section in your Bible if you're looking at it that's
Yeah.
like different than the other text.
yeah, it looks like poetry all of a sudden.
Yeah.
It's set apart. If you're using the New American Standard or the Legacy Standard Bible, it's in all caps, right? To make it very clear, this is an Old Testament quote. So it says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord."
Mm.
The problem with the old covenant is the people.
Yeah.
We see this at the very beginning. Exodus 24, Moses comes down from the mountain. He has the covenant. He reads the law to the people, and the people say, "All the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do."
Yeah.
They say it several times. And he sprinkles the law with the blood. He sprinkles them with the blood. And then God calls him back up so that he can receive the vision of the heavenly tabernacle and receive the instructions for how to build it.
Uh-huh.
And while he's up there for 40 days. These people who had just said, "All that the word the Lord has spoken, we will do," come to Aaron and say, "Make us a god who will lead us."
Yeah.
And we've got Exodus 32, which is the golden calf incident. So we,
Mm-hmm.
at the very beginning, they enter into this covenant with God, and they hear the sanctions, right? These curses if you break these, break this covenant, and they say, "We'll do it," and then they create an idol,
Yeah.
and they worship it.
Mhm.
They have a big party, so they break it. We see a summary of this in Jeremiah 7, verses 23 through 26. God gives them this covenant, tells them to do this. If you do it, you'll live, and they don't do it.
Mhm.
Right? God tells them in Deuteronomy chapter 10, "Circumcise your hearts."
Yeah.
How do you do that, Jay?
Right.
What's the procedure for circumcising your own heart?
Yeah. Well, what does
Right.
that mean? Let's get it. Maybe ask that question.
Yeah. What does it mean?
Yeah.
What does it mean?
It would imply something's wrong with your heart.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's impurity in
Yeah.
you. There's wickedness, and you're supposed to cut it out
Uh-huh.
and cut it off of you. But the problem is you can't do it.
Uh-huh.
And the weakness of the law is that the law can't do it for you. So the law can tell you what not to do. Don't commit adultery. Don't murder. Don't lie. Don't steal. Don't covet. But it doesn't give you the means to do it. Right?
Right.
Like, how do you even police the 10th commandment? Do not covet.
Right.
Like how do you police that? Because it's in your heart. And Jesus even expands it. He reveals. He kind of pulls back the curtain and he says, "Look, it's far more than just this outward action."
Mm-hmm.
So the Pharisees in Jesus's time, they'd look at the sixth commandment, "Don't murder," and they would say, "I've never killed anyone," and they'd say, I'm a law keeper." And Jesus says, "Well, if you have hate, if you're angry with your brother without cause, you're in danger of hell." They would look at the seventh commandment, don't commit adultery, and they'd say, I've always been faithful to my wife. And Jesus says, if you've ever lusted after a woman with your eyes, you've committed adultery with her in your heart. The problem is it is a radical problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's a complete and total problem. And the law can point it out to you, and the law can threaten you, but that's it.
Right.
Because the law is written on stone.
Mm-hmm.
It's written on stone tablets. You can read it, but the end of the day, it's up to you.
Mm-hmm.
And so he says he finds fault with them because they didn't keep the covenant. They did not continue in my covenant. And so God says, I showed no concern for them.
Yeah, and so this is the superiority of the new covenant, is that the new covenant, which Christ mediates, actually deals with the heart problem.
Right.
It circumcises the heart.
Mm-hmm.
The theological term is regeneration. God gives a new heart through the power of the Holy Spirit. But this isn't a surprise that appears in the New Testament, right?
Right.
Because it's God tells them that He's going to do it in the Old Testament. That
It's all over the place. It's all the way back in Deuteronomy.
Mm-hmm.
So Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 16 talks about circumcise the foreskin of your heart, no longer be stubborn. And then we have the book of Deuteronomy that has all these laws. Deuteronomy 30 is a prophecy that you're not going to do it. You're going to go into exile. And when you come out of exile, Deuteronomy 30, I believe it's verse 16. I believe it's verse 16 also. It promises that God will circumcise your heart.
Mm-hmm.
That's the new covenant. It's the promise of the new covenant all the way back in Deuteronomy.
Mm-hmm.
And so we see promises, and it starts to expand as we see the prophets. Isaiah talks about this covenant that is going to be made. Ezekiel talks about how God, after the exile, is going to take out their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. It's going to give a new spirit to them, so that they actually will want to obey. The other prophets, they talk about these days that are coming when God is going to actually save his people.
Mm-hmm.
And so what the law couldn't do, the new covenant will do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Paul says in Romans 8, verse 3, that God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, the problems with them, could not do by sending his son in the flesh to condemn sin.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the law is powerless to change you. It can only condemn you. Because by the time you read it, Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 7. I wouldn't have even known what coveting was until I read the law. And as soon as I read do not covet, the law killed me, right? Because
he realized what he is.
Realizes he's a lawbreaker. As soon as you read the law, you recognize it came too late, right? I'm already a lawbreaker.
Uh-huh.
All it does is reveal your guilt.
Yeah.
It kills you. It can't save you. But the new covenant actually does.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's far superior to the old.
Right. Okay, so the third is Christ's better. How was it? It's enacted on better promises. I think I missed the first word you read. So Christ's covenant is enacted on better promises.
Right. Yep.
So there's the promise of new hearts. Right. Those promises are given.
Yeah.
All throughout the Old Testament. The promise of God's presence with his people, with all of his people.
Yeah.
Promises that every person of the new covenant will actually know the Lord. No one will have to come to you and say, know the Lord, because every member of the new covenant has actually been taught by God and knows the Lord.
Right.
Sins are actually dealt with for real, permanently.
And that verse 12, that should be that should have been a staggering promise, because remember the Israelites, they had to offer sacrifices every single day, for all their sins. They every year there was the Day of Atonement, and it was just a constant reminder of sin. That's what chapter 10 tells us in verse 3. These sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year. And here God says, I'll remember their sins no more.
Yeah.
That should be like seismic,
Mhm.
right? Something is going to happen where our sins are actually going to be dealt with.
Right. Yeah.
And it's something that the law can't do because the law prescribes these
Continual.
continual sacrifices.
Mhm.
Yeah, but the new covenant promises an actual end to sin.
Mhm. Yeah. Let's talk about the this verse. I think it'd be interesting for people that are in the new covenant. Where's it at? Verse 11. They shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So this will be maybe a little extra info for people. So there's a difference between.
And we don't want to go too deep because next week I'm going to
Okay,
talk about this
all right.
some more.
Well,
So we don't
we
want to
can
talk
pump
about
the brakes
too
if you
much.
want to.
But the idea of knowing the Lord is more than just intellectual.
Uh-huh.
It's relational. So you look at 1 Samuel chapter 2, I believe it is verse 12, and you have Hophni and Phinehas.
Mm-hmm.
They're priests. They're actual Levites.
Yeah.
Right. And yet they are described as worthless men, literally sons of Belial, sons of the devil. They do not know the Lord.
Mm.
Now, these are priests.
Yeah.
Again, they are ministering in the tabernacle under the law. It's not intellectual. They know who Yahweh is, right? But they don't know him.
Mm-hmm.
There is something that's missing,
Mm-hmm.
and it's that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
In the next chapter, 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 7, it says that Samuel didn't know the Lord yet. So as a young boy, he never heard the word of God because he didn't know the Lord yet until one night the Lord comes to him,
Calls to him, yeah.
and he knows him.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's more than just intellectual.
Mm-hmm.
Because Judges chapter 2, verse 10, Joshua and his generation die, and another generation arises who do not know the Lord.
Mm.
It's not that they don't have intellectual knowledge; it's
Right.
that they don't actually know him.
Mm-hmm.
The Hebrew word yada, it carries the connotation of a deep, intimate knowledge and relationship. Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore a son.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's more than just head knowledge. It's an intimate relationship, and so there's something lacking in Israel. They don't know God. Hosea in chapter 4, verse 6, he actually says that my people perish for lack of knowledge. But the new covenant is going to rectify that, and every member of the new covenant is going to know God in this way.
Right. Whereas in the old, there would be some who knew the Lord this way.
Yeah, at some point, Samuel knew the Lord.
Yeah.
And Hophni and Phinehas still did not.
All right.
But they're both still in the covenant.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
But we'll talk about that some more next week.
That's right. That covenant cannot be broken. This is a great implication of this.
Yeah. So the four that you stated already are explicitly given.
Mm-hmm.
The law will be on their hearts. That they will be his people. He'll be their God. They'll know him. Their sins will be forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's a few more that are implied in the text, but they're not quite as clearly laid out.
Yeah.
And the first one is that the new covenant is unbreakable. That's good news, because verse 9 says that the old covenant was breakable. The people did not keep the covenant, and so God had no regard for them, and so they went into exile.
We should make explicit that God never broke his covenant with them.
Yeah, God didn't break the covenant. They did.
They broke covenant with God, yeah. And even after they do, he still would redeem them.
Yeah, right.
Like over and over.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because he's like super gracious.
Yeah.
Well, because he has to keep his covenant.
He's keeping his covenant with
Abraham.
Yeah, right. And with himself.
And with
He's
himself.
the persons of the Trinity are
Right.
keeping covenant with each other. But the new covenant is unbreakable.
Mm-hmm.
This is why we would believe that there's eternal security.
Right.
Right.
That you can't.
You can't break it. That's
Right.
that's the promise. The promise is not, well, God's not going to break it, because God didn't break the old covenant. The people did. But in the new covenant, the people won't be able to break it.
Right. Now, where do you get that from in there? In the
Well,
text?
I mean, it's verse 9. It's not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, for they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no regard for them. So if it's not going to be like that covenant,
Uh-huh.
it's better. Well, what would be better about it if it still was breakable? If you still could break it, then it's no better than the law,
Mhm.
right? You're still not keeping the commands, and so God's going to show no regard for you. But because of Christ and his superior ministry, it's unbreakable.
Mhm.
You can't break it.
Right. Not only can you not, but the issue is you can't do it because you don't want to do it.
Yeah.
So we're getting a little philosophical discussion about say, right? You
Yeah.
can. That's how you operate. Like you do things you want to do.
Right.
So a member of the new covenant, the one who possesses the Holy Spirit, whose heart's been regenerated, will never want to
Right.
even break the covenant.
Because you have the law not written on stone tablets, you have the law written on your heart.
Right. Yeah. And it will never end.
Mm-hmm. And we see that in verse 13.
Mm-hmm.
In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away.
Okay.
So it's I wasn't able to dive into this as much as I had it in my notes because of time. But the word obsolete, it means that it's abrogated, it's abolished.
Okay.
Right. And
So-
it's growing old. That word refers to the decay that comes with old age.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then to vanish away, it was used in that early Greek time to talk about a piece of legislation that it becomes inoperative because it's no longer relevant to the changed circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a piece of law that it's irrelevant because the circumstances have changed. And what I was thinking about was the abolition bills that we've promoted before, and one of the criticisms is that, well, it's going to get rid of all these other pro-life laws,
Uh-huh.
and that's the point. If abortion was completely outlawed, then you don't need all these other little laws that say, well, abortion is legal up to this point.
Mm.
It would be irrelevant because the new law has encompassed everything else.
Okay.
Right. That's what is happening here. The law is passing away because it's become irrelevant because the new covenant has already dealt with all of it.
All right. So some people listening if they've kind of grown up in church and read the Bible, they may have like a question, a counter point perhaps from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where he says in Matthew chapter 5, beginning verse 17, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." So how, for that person wondering, hey, well, what is the writer of Hebrews talking about then? The law is like passing away. Jesus said it won't pass away until it's all accomplished.
Yeah.
Or heaven and earth won't even pass away. The law will remain until all is accomplished.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it's verse 5
Mm-hmm.
that it was a shadow and a copy of the greater reality. So the law is not going to pass away until all is accomplished. It's accomplished in Christ, in his life, his death, his resurrection.
Right. Well, interesting to me that he uses the word "it is finished" or "it is accomplished"
Right.
or fulfilled. Like
Right.
he has filled up everything to which all of the law and the prophets were meant
Right.
when he gave up his spirit to his Father, and he died, and that was it. It was all accomplished. Well,
Right.
and then the resurrection happened. But that's how I read it.
Yeah.
That he's. I mean, we think when you read it, you think, oh, well, he means like heaven and earth will not pass away until it's all accomplished. That means it will just go on until the earth ends.
Right.
But the the word at the end is important until it is accomplished.
Mhm. Right.
So he came to fulfill the law, and he did accomplish it.
Right. Yeah. That doesn't mean that the moral law passes away. It means that the law as a whole, the covenant, passes away.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not under the old covenant anymore. The old covenant has vanished.
Right.
And there's no more dramatic way for this to have happened than in AD 70 when the Romans came in and they destroyed the temple.
Right.
Right? They tore the temple down brick by brick. They slaughtered the priest, and so for almost 2,000 years, there has been no temple. There have been no Levitical priests. There have been no animal sacrifices. It's because the new covenant has come.
Mm-hmm.
So God in His sovereignty, He didn't just announce a new covenant and enact a new covenant and then leave the old covenant system in place. In His sovereignty, He ordained history to move in a way that the Jews would rebel and the Romans would come back and they would destroy everything. And so the Romans were responding to a rebellion, but what they actually were doing is that they were bringing a complete end to the old covenant system.
Mm-hmm.
They were accomplishing God's work of being the sledgehammer that would just smash the remnant of the old covenant.
Right.
So this verse right here, verse 13, is reason why I think that the book of Hebrews was written before AD 70.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it was written after, where would these Jews be returning to anyway? They wouldn't
Right.
be Why is he spending so much time on the Levitical priests and the temple and the sacrifices if they've been gone, if they're already gone?
Mm-hmm.
What are they going back to? So I think that this is still operational when the writer is penning this letter.
Right.
But it's near to vanishing away.
Right.
That's the, I don't know why the ESV puts is ready to vanish away. It's the Greek word near.
Mm.
It's near to vanishing away. So it's coming. It's very close.
And the last one is a new covenant is all of grace.
Yep.
And you said 6 times there's the words I will
Mhm.
are here.
Right.
God will.
Yeah, God's going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the people don't initiate this. They don't write the law in their own hearts.
Mm-hmm.
God does it. God is going to be merciful toward their iniquities, despite all their rebellion, despite all their sin, despite the fact that they have this inability. God is going to do this for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not of works. It's something that God alone does for His people,
Mm-hmm. Right.
and that's good news.
And continues
That's
doing
good news.
in them.
That's why the new covenant is often called the covenant of grace,
Right.
because God, in His grace, has done what the law couldn't do.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a covenant of works. It's a covenant that God is the sole initiator, and He applies it effectually to His people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Awesome. Good stuff. So what's going on next week?
Well, we're going to talk about Baptist,
Okay.
because I think that there's plenty of new people in our congregation that maybe have never thought through why they attend a Baptist church.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope to show them from the New Covenant passage that it leads me to Baptist theology.
So you're sticking with chapter 8?
So we're going to stick with chapter 8. We're going to look at, I think we're just going to look at probably 7 through 13.
Okay.
Probably will be what we
All right. Awesome.
look at. So I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into the New Covenant and make some, just show some implications.
Okay. Good stuff. All right. Thank you, George.
Yep.
All right. Thanks for listening. Conform to Christ podcast. And our goal, our aim is to engage the mind, affect the heart, and call people to follow Christ and to help you and to assist you in that endeavor. And so hopefully Text Driven Tuesday helps you to understand the Bible better and helps you to follow Christ better. If it does, please give us a like, subscribe, maybe share this with your friends, maybe write us a review. Help us get the word out. And hopefully you'll come back this Friday for Free for All Friday. We'll see you then. Bye bye.